The morning sun had barely cleared the tree-line at Fort Moore when the traditional cadence of physical training was interrupted by an unfamiliar briefing. A lecture hall, usually reserved for tactical reviews and weapons systems operations, was retrofitted with slide decks detailing cultural competency, systemic bias, and inclusive leadership models. In the middle rows sat Master Sergeant Marcus Vance, a combat veteran with 3 tours in the Helmand province, staring at a slide on intersectionality while trying to reconcile it with the reality of maintaining operational readiness in a depleted mechanized infantry platoon. For Vance, the military had always functioned on a brutal, uncompromising calculus. Either you could pull your battle buddy out of a burning vehicle, or you couldn't. The introduction of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives felt to him like a corporate template forced upon a warrior culture. Around him, the room was silently divided. The older NCOs exchanged subtle, tight-lipped glances of skepticism, viewing the training as political overreach from a Pentagon civilian leadership more concerned with public relations than lethal capability. They whispered in the hallways about standards being quietly adjusted and the erosion of the meritocracy that had historically bound disparate young Americans into a cohesive unit. Yet, a few rows down sat Second Lieutenant Maya Lin, a recent West Point graduate representing the changing face of the officer corps. To Lin, these seminars weren't a distraction. They were a long-overdue correction to a system that had historically ignored the unique friction faced by minority soldiers. She looked at the same recruitment data the Pentagon was panicking over, a historic shortfall in enlistment, a generation of young Americans deeply alienated by traditional military culture, and saw DI as a survival mechanism. If the modern army wanted to attract the tech-savvy, highly capable youth needed for cyber warfare and advanced logistics, it had to speak their language and guarantee an equitable environment. The tension stayed quiet, confined to policy debates and hushed mess hall conversations, until the platoon was mobilized for a high-stakes, multi-domain readiness exercise in the California desert. As the dust kicked up at the National Training Center, the theoretical debate about wokeism versus combat readiness was about to collide with a simulated near-peer adversary, forcing both Vance and Lin to test whether a socially conscious military could still hold the line. The heat of the Mojave Desert at the National Training Center didn't care about shifting cultural paradigms or Pentagon press releases. Under the blinding sun, the simulated combat environment pushed the platoon to its absolute psychological limits. The exercise pitted them against a highly sophisticated, aggressive, opposing force, mimicking a near-peer adversary. Within the first 12 hours, communication lines were jammed, 2 supply trucks were visually marked as destroyed by laser sensors, and the chain of command was instantly fractured. Master Sergeant Vance occupied a shallow fighting position, his radio crackling with static and chaotic casualty reports. To him, the chaos confirmed his worst fears. The unit lacked the raw, unblinking cohesion that only comes from absolute uniformity in training and purpose. He had watched the preparation weeks prior become fragmented by administrative compliance, and now, in the dirt, the cost was being paid. When a simulated artillery strike took out the platoon leader, the responsibility of coordinating a counteroffensive fell squarely into a vacuum, exposing the growing friction between the old guard methodology and the new generation. Second Lieutenant Lin found herself thrust into the command role under the worst possible conditions. As she attempted to recalculate their defensive perimeter using a digital tactical network, her style immediately clashed with Vance's instinctual, top-down execution. Lin relied heavily on collaborative input from her specialized tech operators, younger soldiers who felt empowered by her inclusive leadership style to speak up about vulnerabilities in the drone surveillance feed. To Vance, this looked like hesitation and a dangerous breakdown of discipline. In his world, you didn't hold a committee meeting when the perimeter was collapsing. The breaking point arrived at dusk when a simulated hostile infantry squad breached the eastern ridge. A critical decision had to be made regarding the deployment of a reserve fire team. Lynn, looking at the diverse skill sets of her personnel, chose a non-traditional team led by a junior specialist who possessed superior spatial analysis skills, bypassing a senior corporal whom Vance trusted implicitly based on raw physical endurance alone. With the laser engagement sensors humming and the countdown ticking, the two philosophies were no longer just talking points in a lecture hall, they were actively dictating the tactical survival of the unit. The laser sensors on Vance's vest buzzed a steady, deafening tone, signaling a catastrophic hit. The eastern ridge had fallen. The simulated ambush had decimated their position, and as the dust settled into the cold desert night, the platoon was ordered into a mandatory tactical pause by the training observers. In the dim, red hue of the command tent, the silence between Vance and Lynn was heavier than the desert air. The failure of the exercise hung over them, but the autopsy of why they failed opened a deeper, more visceral rift. Vance threw his combat vest onto a wooden crate, the frustration he had suppressed for months finally breaking through. For him, the afternoon's defeat was the direct result of a fractured command, a symptom of an army that had traded instinctive obedience and physical dominance for consensus building and intellectual accommodation. He argued that by bypassing the senior corporal, Lynn had broken the unspoken contract of the infantry. Trust is built on time in the dirt and raw physical capability, not technical specialization. To Vance, the platoon had become soft, overly sensitive, and paralyzed by a fear of stepping on toes, leaving them completely unequipped for the brutal simplicity of a firefight. Lynn refused to back down, her voice tight but measured. She pointed directly at the tactical logs on the monitor, showing that the senior corporal's team had consistently misread the electronic warfare data earlier in the day, a mistake that had allowed the enemy drone to pinpoint their coordinates in the first place. She countered that Vance's version of a cohesive unit was a relic of the past, an exclusionary club that refused to adapt to a reality where wars are won in the electromagnetic spectrum as much as in the trenches. By treating the younger, tech-minded soldiers as cogs rather than assets, she argued, the old guard was actively sabotaging the military's future. The argument quickly rippled outward from the command tent to the rest of the encampment. Around the campfires, the platoon split along ideological lines that mirrored the wider civilian culture war back home. Younger soldiers rallied behind Lynn, muttering about outdated toxic leadership that measured worth solely by a 2-mile run time. Meanwhile, the career NCOs stood with Vance, quietly mourning the loss of a meritocracy they felt was being dismantled to satisfy political quotas. As the stars fully emerged over the Mojave, the platoon was no longer fighting a simulated foreign enemy. They were completely consumed by an internal battle over the very soul and identity of the American soldier.
A simulated mass casualty event was triggered at a remote observation post 5 miles out, accompanied by a complete blackout of satellite communications and GPS routing. The digital networks Lynn relied upon went dark, and the clear-cut metrics of technical superiority instantly vanished into the shadows of the desert canyons. The unit was forced to move blind into unpredictable terrain, carrying heavy gear through deep sand, with an aggressive enemy force hunting their heat signatures. Physical exhaustion quickly began to level the intellectual playing field. The tech-savvy specialists, highly capable behind a monitor, began to stagger under the crushing weight of their 70-pound rucksacks during the forced march. Recognizing the imminent collapse of the pace, Vance stepped into the gap, his decades of muscle memory and raw physical leadership taking over. He didn't give orders through a screen. He physically moved down the line, redistributing weight, pulling lagging soldiers forward, and enforcing tactical intervals through sheer force of will. Lynn, watching her modern operational model bend under the weight of basic infantry physics, had to adjust her approach in real time, realizing that innovation means nothing if a unit cannot physically reach the objective. Yet, the terrain threw a counterpunch that Vance's traditional playbook couldn't solve. The approach to the casualty site was heavily choked by a sophisticated web of civilian communications and localized drone signals, creating an electronic trap that would expose any standard approach. Here, Vance's instinct to simply push through with raw aggression would have led the platoon straight into a simulated ambush. Recognizing the trap, Lin utilized her understanding of decentralized command, giving her young electronic warfare specialists the autonomy to construct a makeshift signal decoy using civilian frequencies, a non-standard tactic that completely fooled the opposing forces' sensors and cleared a safe corridor for the advance. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the platoon successfully reached the evacuation zone, executing the mission just minutes before the strict deadline. They stood covered in dirt, sweat, and lithium battery grease, completely spent. The training observers noted the success, but inside the unit, the realization was far more profound. The old guard had kept the body of the platoon moving when physical reality threatened to break it, while the new guard had provided the brainpower to navigate a battle space that no longer operated by old rules. The two leaders stood at the hood of a Humvee, looking at a map, both realizing that the ultimate test of the modern military wasn't about choosing one philosophy over the other, but surviving the friction of blending them together before the real war started. The final evaluation report from the National Training Center did not declare a victory for either side of the Pentagon's ideological divide. Instead, it read like a stark warning. As the platoon boarded the transport buses back to Fort Moore, the dust of the Mojave settled, but the fundamental question remained suspended over the entire infrastructure of the United States Armed Forces. Can an institution designed for absolute conformity adapt to a highly individualized society without losing its lethal edge? The battlefield had proved that the fierce debate dominating cable news and congressional hearings, the binary war between a traditional warrior ethos and modern diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, was a false dilemma manufactured for civilian consumption. Out in the dirt, the military's real crisis wasn't the presence of social progress, nor was it the adherence to rigid traditions. It was the dangerous polarization that treated these two concepts as mutually exclusive. The exercise demonstrated that an army relying solely on physical dominance would be blinded in a modern electronic wasteland, while an army relying purely on technological intellect and corporate inclusivity would collapse under the brutal physical realities of sustained combat. Master Sergeant Vance and Lieutenant Lin represented the two halves of a fractured superpower trying to redefine its identity. For the American military to survive its greatest recruiting and cultural crisis in half a century, the path forward required a ruthless pragmatism that transcended politics. The meritocracy could not be dismantled to satisfy public relations quotas, but the definition of merit had to expand to include the intellectual and technological capabilities required for modern warfare. True readiness was not found in a corporate slide deck, nor was it found in pretending the demographic and technological shifts of the 21st century did not exist. As the gates of Fort Moore closed behind them, the story of the platoon mirrored the broader challenge facing the Pentagon. The true strength of the modern American soldier would not be decided by who won the culture war, but by the military's ability to forge a new, uncompromising synthesis, an institution that is inclusive enough to reflect the nation it defends, yet disciplined, physically robust, and lethal enough to terrorize the adversaries it is built to destroy. In the end, the battlefield remains an unforgiving auditor, caring nothing for ideology, and recognizing only the units that can hold the line together. The author's verdict: the false binary of the modern battlefield. The fiercest battle currently facing the United States military isn't being fought in the South China Sea or the plains of Eastern Europe, it is being waged within the halls of the Pentagon and the barracks of its own bases. The cultural civil war over wokeism versus tradition has turned the world's most powerful fighting force into a political football. But as the dirt, sweat, and friction of reality prove, the entire debate as presented to the American public is a dangerous, manufactured illusion. The core of the issue is not that the military is trying to evolve, it is that the civilian culture war has forced a hyperpolarized binary onto an institution that requires absolute pragmatism to survive. The trap of the old guard, adhering blindly to a legacy model of the military. One that measures a soldier's worth exclusively by physical dominance and traditional uniformity, ignores the terrifying reality of modern, multi-domain warfare. In an era dictated by electronic warfare, cyber defense, and algorithmic logistics, an army of pure muscle is an army that gets wiped off the map before it ever sees the enemy. To recruit and retain the specialized intellect required for the 21st century, the military must adapt to demographic realities. The danger of corporate overreach, conversely, treating the armed forces like a Fortune 500 company by prioritizing corporate diversity metrics and public relations over combat lethality is a recipe for catastrophe. The battlefield is not an office space, it is an unforgiving auditor. Physical endurance, unquestioning discipline, and a shared warrior ethos are not outdated concepts, they are the baseline requirements for keeping human beings alive under fire. Ultimately, the woke army debate exposes a deeper, existential crisis. America is struggling to define what its warriors should look like in a fractured society. The conclusion is as brutal as it is simple. True combat readiness is not found in a political slide deck, nor is it found in pretending the world hasn't changed since 1991. The United States military will not win the wars of tomorrow by choosing one side of the culture war. It will win by forging an uncompromising synthesis. An institution that is inclusive enough to attract the best minds of the nation it represents, yet lethal, disciplined, and ferocious enough to terrify the adversaries it is built to destroy. On the battlefield, bullets do not care about ideology, they only care about competence.